The Apostle Paul has said to the church at Ephesus and to us that your struggle is not against the physical world. Verse 12 of chapter 6, flesh and blood. That's where it is expressed. That's not where it's rooted. That's merely where the fruit manifests itself. It's not against the physical world, flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers and world forces of this darkness, spiritual wickedness in heavenly places. Whatever is plaguing you today emanates from the spiritual realm. So if you and I do not address the cause, you can't get to the cure. The enemy doesn't want you to know or take seriously that it emanates from the spiritual realm, because then you might address it spiritually. As long as he can keep you dealing with the fruit and bypass the root, he can keep you hostage. Paul says your wrestle is in another realm. It's in heavenly places. And because your battle is in the spiritual realm, that's where your fight must be. But the good news is he tells you to stand firm, because in that realm, Jesus has already gotten victory. In the spiritual realm, regardless of what you're going through in the physical realm, in the spiritual unseen realm, Jesus Christ has already gotten victory. You are victorious in the invisible, even though you may be thoroughly defeated in the visible. So if you want to be victorious in the physical like you are in the spiritual, you must address the physical spiritually. If you don't address the visible physical spiritually, then you have a victory that you're not experiencing because of how the physical is dominating. One of the toughest things for God to get his people to do is to look at life and live life from the spiritual frame of reference and not from the reference point of the five senses. He has given us equipment with which to do that. He comes to verse 18 in Ephesians 6, and he says, with all prayer and petition, pray at all times in the Spirit, with this in view, be on the alert with all perseverance and petition for all the saints, and pray on my behalf. I want you to notice how many times the word or a synonym for prayer is used in that short segment. All prayer and petition, pray. Comes to the end of it, petition for all the saints. Beginning of verse 19, and pray. He closes out this segment with a call to prayer, or what I call putting on the armor. How do you put on the armor? How do you wear what God has given us for victory? How do we grab it, get it, hold on to it? And he tells you in verse 18 and following, he says the answer is prayer. Now the question is, what is it? We talk about prayer, we speak about it, we do it, but I want to take us a little deeper to make sure we understand it. Because when you understand prayer, it changes that you pray, how you pray, whether you pray, and your expectations having prayed. For far too many people, even Christians, prayer is like the national anthem before a football game or a baseball game. For many of us, prayer is like a spare tire. We want it there in case we really need it. But if we don't need it, as long as it's back there somewhere and we can whip it out, particularly in an emergency, then we need it. But I want to explain what Paul wants to explain, which is why he uses it so many times in this verse, coming at the end of this section. Because if you understand prayer in the context of this section, it will change whether you pray and in fact how you pray, and it will change what you get when you pray. Simply defined, I would like to define prayer as earthly permission for heavenly interference. Earthly permission for heavenly interference. It is earth giving heaven permission to interfere or to intervene in what is happening in my world of reality from the spiritual point of view. Prayer is giving heaven permission to intervene. Now, that raises a question. Why does heaven need permission? You have to understand how God organized the world to work. He organized the world to work through people. Therefore, when he created Adam and Eve, he said, let them rule. So God has given us rulership over the earth. And he joins us when invited to do so. Prayer doesn't make God do anything. Okay? Prayer doesn't force him, cajole him. If God doesn't plan to do it, I don't care how much you pray about it. Prayer does not force God's hand. But what prayer does is it calls on God to intervene in ways he wants to intervene anyway, but won't do it until requested to do so. In other words, there are certain things God's going to do because, he's God and he can do it. But there are many things, and maybe even most things, that God does not intervene on unless requested. Because he wants to know you want him. You need him, desire him, and have expectations of him. And so he does not intervene or participate unless requested to do so. You can leave him out. You can put him on the shelf. You can act independently of him. Because God has given you and me the right to leave him out.
If the enemy can't discourage you, he'll try to scare you. He will remind you of how Goliath has been victorious over others. He'll run the list of everyone who tried and failed, of everyone who was diagnosed and died, of everyone who gave it their best and came up short, of everyone who wanted to but couldn't, of folk who dreamed and never saw it come to reality. He will run the list of how Goliath has defeated others who have stood in your shoes with the same vision to try to scare you to think that the experiences of others set limitations on you. That the enemy will try to convince you that the experiences of others ultimately set limitations on you. And here's what David says. David says, listen. When you walk with God and you've got undeniable evidence that God is in your life, you will never allow yourself to be limited by someone else's past failures. Say that again. When you've got evidence that God is in your life, you will not limit God by what others could not do. When you've got evidence that God has been working in your life, you just believe that the same God who started it back then is a God who's able to keep it going right now. Now, I want to teach you something. Anointed does not mean you talk in 1,000 tongues. Anointed doesn't mean you lay hands on folk and they fall out. Anointed doesn't mean you can prophesy and speak things into existence in people's life. What anointed literally means is that you have physical evidence that the Spirit of the Lord is resting on your life. You've got evidence that God's hand must be on you. You've got evidence that the Lord is working in your life. That evidence is not the Bible you carry. It's not the scriptures you quote. It's not the church you go through. But there's some people who can look back at the hell they've been in and declare the only reason I came out is because the hand of God must have been on my life. And therefore I know I'm anointed. After all the hell I've been through, I must be anointed. After all the struggles I survived, I must be anointed. After all the surgeries I've come through, I must be anointed. After all the